Today I will speak briefly about the role of historians in public policy in the past, and then talk a little bit about what we are trying to do today. This is especially appropriate because so many of you are considering possible careers in public policy. And this is really amazing because at a time when I came out with my PhD, the academics did not want to hear that you were interested in politics or doing something other than just being an academic professor. And today, as you can have heard, we have gone a long way in our department and in our country to take another look at that responsibility. Before the Civil War, best-selling books by novelists and literary historians provided colorful accounts of the past that stimulated a lot of interest. These were bestsellers in its day in the antebellum period. This historical literature provided mainly entertainment rather than any attempt to improve antebellum society. This was seen as entertainment that was okay. It wasn't like reading a novel, although sometimes they were written like they were writing a novel. And by the late 19th century, these amateur historians still were writing popular histories. What is interesting is that there is a change, and that is as colleges and universities developed in America, we had more professional historians who now took a larger role. These new historians wrote more scholarly accounts, but had a smaller public audience than the popular amateur historians. In the first half of the 20th century, academic historians stressed the practical benefits of their discipline, and some volunteered to assist our government during World War I and World War II. So during periods of crises, historians did have skills that people wanted and help with, and they were willing to do so because that was part of the profession's responsibility. After World War II, most academic historians studied the past mainly for itself rather than for trying to influence post-war policymakers. While scholars still valued historical knowledge, many of them rejected the idea of any specific lessons from history for dealing with current problems. This was reinforced by the suspicion that some historians who advocated particular policies frequently were not objective in their own scholarly work. And this is really very true of the 1960s, when there was a lot of student unrest and protest about the Vietnam War, and on college campuses, faculty members who tended to be older, who had a different view of public policy, now became very hostile to it. At the same time, as historians became less interested in doing policy analysis, policymakers showed no interest in historians. Instead, policymakers relied on their own personal staffs or other social scientists rather than consulting professional historians. So with the Kennedy administration, you get a wave of academics coming to Washington, mainly economists, people who are in the social sciences. Very rarely would you have a historian, or there may be one token historian. And this was a pattern now for most presidential activities, even though each group brought their own advisors in. These other policy advisors compared the costs and benefits of alternative solutions, readily predicted future outcomes, and did not hesitate to make bold policy recommendations. When you're in Washington or in Lansing, and somebody asks you, what should they do, or what does history tell you about it, you answer, and you have to be bold because they expect it. They don't want to have you do what most historians do. We tend to be cautious. We're very comfortable about telling people not to move ahead without thinking more about it. And we never recommend policy options. One of the reasons is most of us don't know any policy options. When you're a historian or any other specialty, if you do colonial history, which is my background, and antebellum period, you don't necessarily know what's going on in the world and what the kind of issues are coming up. And so it's very hard for many historians to actually give those recommendations. Today, there is more interest in policy making among professional historians in America. During the past 30 years, for example, historians helped to establish the Journal of Policy History. In addition, historians now are publishing more essays and books that address current policy issues, even though some of their colleagues continue to question that involvement. I remember when I came here and I had other job offers, which is very typical for our faculty because there isn't high demand for people who work at the University of Michigan. I remember somebody making a very generous offer to me if I would come there, and they were very happy with my academic work. And I said to them, well, gee, I also have a hobby, which I honestly have to tell you, I am involved in politics and policy, but I work with both sides and I try to be as objective as I can. And you can watch their faces be very upset. They didn't withdraw that offer, but I wonder if I would have gotten it in the first place if they realized that, because they thought, well, you can't be a serious historian. You can't be somebody who's really going to be working in that field if you're spending time looking at these other issues. We also have a lot of public historians, and these go back actually in the 1970s and 1980s on, who work for local, state, and federal governments as archivists, museum curators, national park guides. So there are other opportunities out there that we are also rediscovering. We tend to rediscover it when the job market is bad for historians because people are well trained. These are people who have gotten their PhDs. They're now facing a situation where there's a surplus of historians with good PhDs that cannot find jobs. So this has been an up and down process. We're going through that again, and I think we're doing the right thing about preparing people for a broader set of opportunities out there than some of us were encouraged in the old days. Now, there are advantages for using history in policy making. I will mention just a few of these based mainly on my work with education policies, both here at the University of Michigan and in the U.S. Department of Education during both the Bush and Clinton administrations. Knowledge of the past is actually very important to all of us, and I think that we don't understand how often we have misleading analogies of the past. So often you hear the economy is good today. It's had a very good reception in terms of the new labor force figures. And then somebody will say, well, it looked really good in 1929 when the Depression was coming, and now I think the Depression is going to really do us in. They don't necessarily understand much except they've heard about 1929. There was a real depression. They don't know about the causes. They don't know anything about it, but we tend to bring in that past. One of the things that we do as historians is we try to be more careful about these analogies. And that's actually very useful because we all, at least of a certain age group, remember the Munich Agreement with the Nazis and the problems that caused. So people have an image of the past which may not necessarily be very accurate. Now, while an historical approach cannot predict what will actually happen in the future, it does help to identify and clarify important questions and issues policymakers should consider before proceeding. Oftentimes, as a historian, you will be hired not because they want a historian, but because they need somebody who knows how to write. Because they have somebody who has the ability to do research in a variety of different settings, and we do that well. But what they don't realize is that I think historians are actually better at predicting what's going to happen. So, for example, we have a 2020 election coming up. We have unusual situations in both parties, but there are some very interesting historical analogies that you might want to think about and keep in mind. We come up with slogans like, well, the economy is good, the economy is everything in an election. Well, and sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. And that's one of the advantages. If you do policy analysis, you're going to have an easier time dealing and understanding these things. Most people who come to Washington, political appointments, last only 2 years. And then they move either to another office or they quit. And now they're getting a little help by people. So these people come in, they don't know what's going on. The employees do, because they've been a while. But the people they bring in as advisors really have no sense of that past. Also, what we find is that we need to rethink of some things that we looked at before and we did better in the past than today. We think we're all so smart that we have great ideas that have never been looked at before. I work on the Head Start program. We are so proud as generations that we invented Head Start and early childhood education. Well, actually, we had infant school in the 1820s and 1830s, way before Head Start. It was a big movement. 40% of the people in Massachusetts, for example, their children went to an infant school at ages 3 to 5. And then the movement disappeared. By 1860, there was nobody at young in there. We never realized that that was there. We had to rediscover it as historians. Now, the reason that ended is because some doctor who was at Harvard thought that early education was going to overstimulate the young mind and they would become insane. Now you think, gee, that's funny. And it is. And this was the best science that we had at the time. But what is interesting is that idea that you should not teach young children too early academic skills is hurting our Head Start program today because some of these things carry over. And again, these are things that we need to rediscover. Also, for example, we do a very bad job, in all honesty, about doing education research in Washington. We don't have the skilled people needed to be able to really run those programs. We have money, but we don't do as well as a lot of other disciplines such as medicine, and we really need to worry about this. Well, both the Bush and Obama administrations, as well as the current Trump administration, is funding almost exclusively smaller, short-term research projects rather than investing in more rigorous long-term research initiatives. We have spent, over time, $3 billion on figuring out how to make Head Start work better. We don't know. 50 years later, we all agreed that Head Start is a good idea. We don't agree on what children should learn. We don't agree on how different people can do this more effectively. And so what we ought to be doing is this more long-term research. For example, in the 1970s, the Brookings Panel on Experimentation said, what you need is a 5-stage strategy for developing and implementing and testing new education programs over a 10-year period. If we had done that, instead of just rushing in and making up these national programs, everybody would be happier today. but we don't. We tend to promise a lot, deliver less, and then hope that everybody forgets it, which, by the way, they do. There are also problems that sometimes history has been misused by educators and policymakers. One difficulty is non-professional historians who write about the past often don't have a good understanding of what's going on. Every member of Congress believes that he or she knows what education is about, what the right ideas are. How? Because they went to school. And you think that, well, if I went through school and I made it, this is what was going on. We have spent $1 billion on American history education on the basis of a senator who's very powerful in Washington, who was able to get large sums of money spent, but he was reflecting his experiences in the 1920s. We spent that $1 billion. This one was something that was not actually stolen, but we wasted it because we didn't get at the kinds of issues that we have facing today, not as we had in the past. So there are a lot of challenges in doing this. Now, the other thing is you say, yeah, now that I believe in history, I'm just going to have a little note about the history of something as I hand in my memo to some advisor. Well, sure, where are you going to get that memo? What we tend to do in Washington is we have people who agree with us. These are the public interest groups on both sides, right and left. They will give you a history very quickly, but that history is usually one-sided. And the problem is, it makes it difficult to do this kind of work. And that's because policymakers are not really relying on more objective studies available. Another thing that we do today is we compare ourselves to the rest of the world. We live in the illusion, as we have for the last 30 years, that we're going to be the #1 in science and math, and we're going to reach it in 10 years. And every 10 years we do not reach it. Fortunately, the news media doesn't pick it up. Most people don't know what is going on. So if I remind you that Goals 2000, for example, in the Clinton administration, promised to be #1 in a series of areas, we didn't make any of those. These politicians literally have said, trust us, we know what we're doing, you give us the money, we'll take care of it, and then you can hold us responsible. Now, did people step up, Republicans and Democrats, and say, whoops, I made a mistake, please do not vote for me? We never hear that. Also, we're now spending so much time looking at test scores and comparing ourselves to other countries that we see who's doing well. Finland, for example, does much better than we do. Canada does much better. This is K through 12 education. Much better than we do. So do we simply say, wow, what is Finland doing, and I'm going to adopt it? I teach a course on education, history, and policy making, an undergraduate course, and we look at Finland. It's not that simple. It's a different culture and a different way. And that's what we have to do, because it's so easy to try to imitate somebody that isn't going to necessarily tell you what we should do here today. The other problem is historians now are producing more work that is policy-oriented. But who are we writing for? We're writing for each other. Why? Because we all are coming up for tenure. We are coming up for our advancement in the profession. Our peer group is the ones that we tend to write for. It's also the group that we know. Most of us know our peers in this area. We don't necessarily know who are these other people. So we are doing a better job today than we did 40, 50 years ago of providing policymakers with these studies. But the problem is that we now have to say, how do we make ourselves more useful? I think a lot of the stuff that we heard today, what the department is doing, is unusually innovative, very positive, and very useful, because you begin to see what are the processes that are going on. The difficulty for historians is, those of us who write about politics and policy often have never been in one of those situations, and so we don't know what they're like. And what's so interesting is that actually, even today, very few historians have actually ever participated in Washington on a regular basis or for a temporary time period. This really hurts your ability to do this kind of work. You wonder why in think tanks you don't see many historians. Because they don't think historians have anything to say or would fit in there. But part of the problem is that we have to begin to look more closely at what these policymakers are doing and what we can do. The good news is there are actually quite a few jobs out there. You're not going to be brought in at the top unless somebody that you have worked for in a campaign probably has noticed you. You're going to be brought in at a lower level, but you're going to have to then be able to take that and to grow with that. Now, the other problem is, suppose you get a job in Washington. It used to be that the Democrats would control the House and Senate routinely. We would trade off on the presidency, Republicans and Democrats, and it was stable enough you could have a nice life. No more. It's changing too fast. In 2000, when there was a changeover in administrations, in the Congress, the lower level people who worked for Congress people lost about 2,000 jobs from the losing party because they didn't get extra seats for staff. And then a couple of years later, we had a changeover. In this kind of a world, you also need some other skills to fall back on, because it's no longer the world people are used to having been brought up in. Now, the other thing about all of this is, most of us think about going to Washington, and I hope some of you have taken advantage of the internships that the university offers. It's actually a very useful project. But Washington is not the only place in America. The majority of government jobs actually are in the state houses. For example, on education, 90% of the education monies come from state and local sources. Washington provides 10%. There are a lot of jobs in Lansing that need to be filled, but most of us don't think that way. And that's one of the things that we need to certainly broaden out. Well, now you've completed your history major. Most of us have been impressed by your work enough to sign off and that you have graduated. The ones that aren't here. And you might say, well, great, this has been fun. I believe that historians can contribute, but I'm not planning to become a professional historian. It is a very competitive business. I'm going to take my history major from an extremely well-placed training place for future individuals and do something else with it. But what do you do? Is there any hope for you, really? One of the things that we forget, a lot of times, I've had a lot of opportunities to work in Washington. Nobody ever hired me as a historian. I got the job for one reason or another, and I could work with people, and I had skills that brought with me. And what you have to do is to take the skills that you have now and make them more valuable and more useful as part of this thing. The difficulty is you say, well, yeah, that's great for you to talk about. You have a job. How am I going to handle it? Well, one of the things I did for this, getting ready for this talk, I thought, gee, it would be interesting to know what people who just get a history major do. Do any of them ever make it at the top? Now, I don't think you believe they do, because I keep talking to people who are majoring in history, and they say, yeah, I'm doing it in spite of my parents. But maybe we should take a closer look. So I went to the internet, and there's a place where they talk about famous history majors in politics and public life. And I'm going to give you just a few examples from that. Famous history majors who became presidents, for example, most of us have trouble naming one. Theodore Roosevelt was a history major. Franklin D. Roosevelt was. Dwight Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, Richard Nixon, and George W. Bush. So what would be also interesting for somebody for their next honors thesis is to ask, how did they use their history background, if they did, when they were in office, what they did. But most of us don't even realize that they could be there. Other famous recent American politicians, just to give you 3 more examples: Newt Gingrich, George McGovern, and Joe Biden. So are you all going to start saying, wow, I'm going to look at those 20 Democrats and find out all the historians, and those are going to be my selections? No, but you ought to say, wait a minute, that's very interesting. Because those are people that are really made good use of that background. Finally, for example, famous recent U.S. Supreme Court justices are Elena Kagan, Antonin Scalia, and Anthony Kennedy. A lot of people have gone on to use that background. So I'm not suggesting that all of you, or any of you, will necessarily become a famous public servant. Most of us aren't. I do think that the type of education you have received here as a history major will be a very useful background to have this greater variety of careers involved with the public services. As a result, I think we can look forward to the involvement by the next generation of historians in policy making, whether these are professional historians or these are people with their undergraduate backgrounds. But one of the things that we have to do, the receptions of your ideas, and we all have ideas when we're in school, and the problem is, how do you get policymakers interested? It depends on getting a variety of different kinds of skills. There is no, it's not just quantitative or qualitative history, it's using different kinds and trying to work off of them. And I think we're going to see this in your generation. So many of us have done this ad hoc. We learn how to adjust, what to do, without much background, without much experience. You have an opportunity to make use of your history major now and begin to think of the careers that you can follow. So I'm going to end with congratulating all our graduating history majors, telling you that all of us faculty members are really proud of you. It's not just we're glad you've graduated, but we are proud of the kind of people that we are working with. And we welcome you to your next stage of your careers.